So my name is Liz Emerson. I'm a co-founder of the Intergenerational Foundation, and I want to welcome you all to this exciting cross-party webinar, which has been organised by Iaf, but we've got really grateful thanks to give to the young Fabians in particular for hosting the event for us. Before we get into the debate, a bit of housekeeping. We do have a Q&A function and a chat function, so please do put your questions into those boxes, and we will try to obviously get your questions answered. Also, let us know if you want us to read your question out for you, or if you'd like to read your question out yourselves, because I have the power to unmute, but I also have the power to mute. A bit of background about Iaf. Pronouns, by the way, feel free to use the pronouns that you want. We really hope that it's going to be a constructive and collaborative debate tonight, from obviously lots of different political parties. We did invite members of conservative parties to join us, the Conservative Environmental Network, Bright Blue, the Young Conservatives, but sadly we couldn't find somebody to participate. So we have tried to be as non-party political as we could be. A bit of background about Iaf before we start. Iaf has been working solely on intergenerational fairness for a decade, and this year is our 10th anniversary. So please do have a look at our anniversary report that's on our website, and it investigates the plight of younger generations over the past decade. It's a long report, and if you go to www.iaf.org.uk/research, you'll find it, or listen to our podcast episode, which is live today. And that is also at www.if.org.uk/what-if-podcast. What do we stand for? Well, we're on a mission to protect the rights of younger and future generations in British policymaking. And we're firmly funded by no strings donations. And we want to ensure that all policy is assessed for its impact on younger and future generations. We are known widely for our work on housing, pensions, mental health, taxation, and much more. We're currently working on environmental, employment, and taxation papers at the moment. Tonight, we really want to enliven interest amongst young political activists on why a debate about the use of the discount rate is vitally important to younger and future generations. So we've invited members from different political parties and supporters to come and debate it with us. So I want to welcome 5 panellists tonight. First of all, I'd like you to wave or show some kind of welcome, please, panellists. Angus Hanton, Iaf co-founder, is an economist who's written extensively on the discount rate. Chris Wongsosaputro is the co-chair, wave Chris, is the co-chair of the Young Fabians Economy and Finance Network. Rowan Munson is the treasurer for the Young Greens. Kyalo Burt-Fulcher is an actuary and pensions lead for the Young Fabians Economy and Finance Policy Group. And Josef Schumacher is an economist and member of the Lib Dems. So there you go. First off, I'm going to ask Angus to see whether he can explain the discount rate and explain why it is important.
Thank you very much, Liz, and hello everyone, and welcome. Let me see. Let me start by saying there is a clear and quite short, easy to read explanation on our website under a little paper, Are We Discounting Young People's Futures? So it is all there, but I'm going to try and summarize very briefly what it is. The discount rate is a bit like a reverse interest rate. It's the rate that we use to work out the present value of a future asset or liability. Now, I hope I haven't lost you there, but put it in day-to-day terms. Would you rather have 100 quid now or 100 quid in a year's time? Most people would say in a year's time. But if you make the question a little more complicated and say, would you rather have 100 quid now or 105 pounds in a year's time, then people start to split what they would prefer. So then the question is, what is £105 in a year's time worth today? And whatever rate you discount back to will get you your answer. If you discount it, I think it's just under 4%, sort of 4.9% or something, you get back to £100. But some people would pay a little more than that for it. So this is what the discount rate is about. And it sounds arcane, but it turns out, and this is what's so interesting about it, it turns out that it really matters. That if you take a rate that the government, the principal use for the government in discount rates is working out what future liabilities of pensions are worth in today's terms. And you may say, well, what does it matter? It's worth whatever they guess it's worth. But it really does matter, because what they think future liabilities are, and therefore from the pensioners' point of view, future benefits are, should determine how much pensioners or say employees pay today for those future benefits. That's one reason it matters. The other reason it matters is it should be an estimate of the liabilities that the government are writing for us all to pay, and particularly for younger people to pay, because they'll have a longer period of paying for these liabilities. And I think the third reason it matters is because it's a statement about the honesty of government. If we're dishonest about accounting, then it allows government to be dishonest about other elements. So it really matters, and to put it in round terms, roughly speaking, public sector pensions are estimated by the government, by the Treasury, to have a current value, the commitments to pay those pensions, a current value of £2 trillion. If you use they use a discount rate, which we'll come on to, I expect, but which is based on their expectations of the future rate growth of the economy. But if you use their rate, you get £2 trillion of liability. But if you use a lower rate, the sort of rate that most economists who've thought about the issue would use, the sort of rate that the private sector uses, you get a liability of over £3 trillion. So it's a very important difference, £1 trillion. I mean, it's getting on for twice what's been spent on COVID, and yet, of course, it's not talked about, whereas the COVID expenditure is. So it matters. The question, I suppose, is who loses by this financial or accounting sleight of hand. And our opinion is that the losers are future taxpayers, and in particular younger people, because they'll have more to pay. And so, coming on to the question of, I think I should just say a little bit more about the mechanics of it before coming on to the question of what can we do about it. There are really two bases on which we can work out what the current liability is. One of them is to say, what private companies would do, is to say what is money worth, and to look at an interest rate, and that's the basis on which we feel. Thank you, Liz. I've just got a note saying my time is running through. That's good, because I haven't got much more to say. But one basis is a financial one, where you say, well, interest rates are, say, 1%, so the discount rate ought to be 1%. I'm talking about real 1% plus inflation. And if you use those discount rates, as I say, you get more than £1 trillion different. Now, the government says, well, there's another way of choosing a discount rate. We'll take account of what the economy will be able to afford to pay. So we'll assume economic growth, which of course the Green Party has mixed feelings about, to put it at the very least. We'll assume as high an economic growth as we can get, and we'll assume we achieve it. And that's the basis on which they use the discount rate of just under 2.5% plus inflation, 2.4% plus inflation. Well, of course, a lot of people don't want that growth, but even those who do want it should be realistic that it may well not be achieved. And the government has a very good record of being wrong on all sorts of things. Sorry, Liz.
I'm going to halt you there, Angus, on that perfect line, because your time is up and you've done a fantastic job. And now I'm going to hand over to Chris. And Chris, is there an easy way to take over from Angus? So
yeah.
Here we go.
I'll present both sides of the argument really on overstating or understating the liability. And that's because I'm no expert in this area. I have a finance background, but not specifically in pension. So just to add on to what Angus is saying, discount rate is the time value of money, as I would put it. And that's how you perceive the money to be today for something that you'll benefit tomorrow. And that's typically widely used in finance to calculate the NPV, net present value, of a project that's supposed to run for a few years and so on, as one case example of using discount rate. And using a fair discount rate is really paramount towards estimating what the true liability is for pension. And that's because that will help to drive spending decisions by government, especially so now in times of COVID, when there are talks about tax rises and also budgetary shortfalls as well, with the government's curtailing key projects like the HS2 Eastern Lake, for instance. And not knowing what the true liability is akin to driving in the darkness without the headlights on, because we never know what the true liability is. And in terms of presenting both sides of the arguments, I'll start with understating the liability. And the way I would classify it is, this is a short-term gain for long-term pain. And that's because understating the liability means that we are currently posing a risk of short-term political expediency when the government actually spends beyond their means, simply because they think that they have to pay less of a pension pot for the future generations. And this is one issue that crosses the intergenerational fairness. And that's because the future generations will have less in their pension pot, even though they might have paid more than they should have currently. And this is again in line with the current trend that we have been seeing about the declining living standards over time. And we certainly do not want this ticking time bomb to explode in the future for future generations to then enjoy less of pension pot, and essentially governments to be able to defer spending now for future generations to then pick up the tab and pick up this higher than expected pension bill. And see, conversely, in terms of overstating the liability, this is an issue of short-term pain, but potentially for an uncertain gain as well. And that's how I would classify it. And that's because overstating the liability can cause the government to cut spending on the economy currently, on public sector benefits, for instance, or on projects simply to set aside more money for pension pot. And doing so can potentially damage the economy, especially right now, when we need to stimulate the economy to recover from COVID pandemic. And drawing back to what Angus was saying earlier, democracy is ultimately based on trust and accountability. So the government owes it to us and themselves to be honest and to disclose the true pension liability using accurate discount rates. And this can be done by engaging with expert stakeholders and having essentially a consultation session where all stakeholders can have a say as to what the true pension rate is, the true discount rate that should be used, and in turn advertise this to the public for people to really understand. And that's one thing that I would urge all the attendees here to have an understanding of, because pension is not something that we often think about. We often think it's akin to be kicked down the road, but actually this is such an important issue for us and helps us in the financial planning when we retire as well. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. We're now going to go over to Rowan. So Rowan, short-term gain over long-term pain. What is the green position on the discount rate?
Yeah, well, it's kind of come quite clear from Chris and from Angus that there are some fundamental problems with understating our pension liabilities. We've already heard about the lack of transparency in the current system, the intergenerational inequity that might result and how these liabilities can skew spending priorities, it's clear that the setting of the discount rate has a real impact on the real lives of real people, both here and now and in the future. And I can see why the proposal's been put forward to release the discount rate from political short-termism by handing it over to an independent panel, handing the setting of it, that is. And in doing so, this could make the discount rate more realistic so that people pay their fair share and so that we avoid this hidden cost being passed on to future generations. I do, however, have some concerns that this proposal limits the abilities of citizens to impact on this important political issue. So I wonder if by kind of zooming out a little bit, we can have a think about some other possibilities. William Morris, in his essay on useful work, said that nature does not give us our livelihood gratis, rather we must win it by toil of some sort or degree. So what he meant by that is that the bread that reaches our table is thanks to labour. Now, there's two periods in which we're unable to labour for our own bread, when we're very young and when we're very old. And in both these cases, we rely on the energy of strong working age people to provide for us. Whilst we see the feeding of our children as an investment, many people seem unable to see the value in providing for the old. And often the question of pensions is framed in terms of how much the old will cost the young. But in terms of seeing the debate that way, we fail to see the value of older people in terms such as the culture, childcare and group identity, which were commonly understood in the yesteryear. I think a truly intergenerational approach to pensions would value contributions made to society by every generation and would reflect their mutual reliance on one another. We also often see the idea of pensions as being putting money away now to spend later, a sense of kind of deferred consumption. But rather, the Greens argue that we need to couch the debate in terms of people's needs and being entitled to have our needs met. After all, what we're concerned about when we're old is not our bank balance, but the fact that there's going to be somebody there when we can't to wash our bodies and to make our food. Indeed, if there are very few working age people, they're able to negotiate higher wages for looking after older people, making older people's money intrinsically worth less. And it's in this way that money is only ever kind of socially constructed and has no independent value in itself. Indeed, we can imagine the situation where we valued our older people enough so that they might be provided for by their working age relatives in the home without money ever needing to change hands. But in any case, it's the balance of people of working age and their dependents, the children and older people that they might be caring for, that matters. So understanding this, rather than having an independently set discount rate, we would propose to transform the system entirely to a real-time pension scheme. So this is a scheme where contributions from working people pay for the pensions of those that are now retired. So you can imagine a real-time scheme for teachers. Unlike other pension schemes, which might rely on over-optimistic predictions of growth or the irrational behaviour of Darth Trader and his colleagues on the stock exchange, the only bet we're making with this scheme is that people will still be having children in the future and that teachers will still be being paid to educate them. And that seems like a far safer bet to us. A real-time scheme therefore emphasises the two important things that I've mentioned. The intergenerational mutual reliance of the energy of strong working people and older people, so working age people relying on the older people for their cultural knowledge, their identity, their childcare, and the older people relying on the working age people for the bread on their table. And a real-time scheme would also reflect that idea that it's labour that's the source of livelihood, rather than pieces of paper with pictures of the Queen on them.
Do you know what, Rowan? You get the gold star because you finished dead on 5 minutes before I had to give you some warning.
Thank you.
You get the gold star at the moment. And we are now going to move over to Kyalo. So, Kyalo, do you want to come back at Rowan now? Or would you prefer to give the Fabians view and then maybe we debate it at the end?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the Fabians doesn't have an official view. We're not allowed to. But what I hopefully I can do is just kind of describe, looking at the private sector, an example, where discount rates come from, why they are what they are, and then broaden that out to the state and look at the differences and what we can infer from that, right? So in my day job, I'm a pensions actuary. I advise sponsors of and the trustees of defined benefit pension schemes in the private sector. So I think that's the best place to start. So the key thing to understand about defined benefit schemes, of which these public sector schemes are, is that it's not like defined contribution benefits that we all have, right? So in a defined contribution scheme, you and your employer make contributions. And forgive me, by the way, if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but I just think this is a useful background, and certainly for many people on the call, it might be helpful. In a DC scheme, you and your employer make contributions, and at retirement, you get a pot of money based on those contributions and whatever investment return's been made, and you can decide what to do with that. DB is different because you're promised a certain level of pension based on your salary and your length of service, with allowances for inflation and things like that, and depending on the specific rules of the scheme. But the key thing to understand is that benefit is not linked specifically to any amount of assets that exist to pay for it, right? So the company promises you that amount, and then it tries to guess how much money it needs to set aside to pay for it in future. And the rationale behind that, of course, is that if you don't do that, the company might not be there in 30 years' time when people are drawing their pensions in order to pay it. So the key question that keeps me and my professional colleagues in a job is how much does a company need to set aside to pay these benefits, right? So in advance of the benefit actually being paid, decades in advance in most instances, no one can be exactly sure what those benefits will be. So you need to make an array of assumptions as to how long people will live, what inflation will be, and because most benefits are linked to inflation in some way, and various other things in order to work out what those benefits should be. But that's not the whole story, right? That's just the assumptions to determine what that payment is when it eventually gets made. As Angus sort of detailed, and as I'm sort of looking at from a different angle, the discount rate is kind of the most important assumption, because what that discount rate does is it transforms that future amount that you've got to pay into a current value that represents the value of that future payment, but right now. In the pensions industry, what you do is you go, we assume that the assets we set aside now are going to return a certain amount, so I don't know, 3%, 5%, whatever. And if they return that amount, we will have enough to pay these liabilities. Or rather, what you say is, how much would we need now if they return that amount to have enough to pay the liabilities? And either, oh great, we've got enough, or oh dear, we don't have enough, can we have some money, some more money please, company, right? So that's the gist of what a pensions actuary does, or sort of the core skill, right? But here's the next wrinkle. We don't just estimate what return we're going to get from the assets, right? Because if we did that, companies would just put their assets in the most risky high return investments they could find. And then their contributions now would be lower because you're expecting those assets to return a higher amount. And so you assume that more of the difference between what you have now and what you eventually need to pay can be made up through returns. So instead what we do is we go, okay, so here's a reasonable portfolio of assets that is an appropriate level of risk for this scheme. And we are going to estimate how much they will return. And then we're going to allow a separate margin for what's called prudence to go, okay, well, what if we don't get that return? What if we only get, if you assume you're going to get 5%, what if we only get 3%? That's how we're going to work out what assets we need to hold now. And so, even if you don't get what you expect to get, there's still a chance that you will have enough assets set aside such that if the employer no longer exists, or if it can't afford to make large contributions some way later down the line, you hopefully still have enough assets to pay your benefits. And you know, it might be that you set aside far too much and you've maybe wasted some of that resource, but clearly the consequence of setting aside too much is, well, it's a bit inconvenient for the company, sure. Maybe it's inconvenient for the members of the scheme who have to pay contributions themselves, but it's much less inconvenient than getting to 60 years' time and running out of money and having loads of pensions to pay. So that's sort of the gist in the private sector, and I guess another angle of looking at what Angus said, right? Now, and it should be noted that, you know, in the private sector, if you do run out of money, you don't lose your benefits. You end up in what's called the pension protection fund, and they sort of look after you, albeit at a slightly less generous rate than you were getting previously. But that's what I've set out before is the kind of theoretical underpinnings of why we fund the way we do and why we allow a margin for prudence. Now that margin for prudence is key, because in the way state benefits are currently funded, we do not allow any margin for prudence. What we say is that we expect government revenues, effectively like the equivalent of the investments for government, which is just the economy. We assume that they're going to grow at what our best estimate for GDP growth is. And therefore, the proportion of assets that we're allocating to these pensions, if we discount them at the GDP rate, is appropriately reflected in how we cost them now. And I think what the key question here is, and I appreciate I may have gone over my time, key question here is given that we really don't know what long-term GDP growth is going to be, and given that the consequences of finding out that it's significantly less than we thought would be a significantly higher proportion of government revenues allocated to paying pensions that were previously accrued than we had expected, and the consequence that means for future taxpayers or for the recipient of future government funds, is it appropriate to consider a particular margin for prudence? And just to wrap up, I mean, it might not be. It might be, as Chris said, well, actually, you know, we do need to fund public services now, and if we allow too big a margin of prudence, actually that we are overweighing those costs, and you know, things are probably going to turn out to be much better than we thought, or we've underinvested. So that is a subjective question, and it's one that I know that the Iaf has a view on, but that I think is the gist of this particular discussion.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Kyalo. That's great. We're now going to move over to Josef. And Josef, do you want to, no, off you go. I'm going to let you talk.
Thank you, Liz. I think there's one great thing about actually being last, which is that I have just about no excuse left to really run over my time. And I thought I'd start making one observation, and perhaps people in the audience felt a bit like that too, which is that to most people, at least the people I talk to before this event, the very notion of having a panel of young people, young politicians, or at least politically minded people, discussing, first of all, pensions, but more in particular, discussing the discount rate element of pensions, felt very strange indeed. And I just like us to hold that thought, because I think it might develop into a bit of a guiding theme throughout the hour or so we're together. I thought it was noteworthy looking back towards 2011 when government, the coalition at the time, last did a deep dive into the way it discounts its pension liabilities. They had really two guiding objectives. One was to fairly reflect the cost of providing those pensions, and the other one being fairly to reflect the risks to government income. And they also sort of implicitly had an objective of setting that rate in a stable fashion. Now, 10 years on, looking back, we know that hasn't quite worked. We've had to change this rate twice already. If we stick to the present methodology, we're going to have to change it again. And that is, on the one hand, a failure against the objectives we had in 2011. But interestingly, back in 2011, we also said, we're going to set this rate in line with our expectation for GDP growth, because doing so was intergenerationally fair. That was an explicit objective. The 2011 review pushed in favor of its choice to go with this method. Given then that we haven't been able to set this interest rate in line with realized GDP growth since, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that at least over the last 10 years, this way of setting discount rates has not been intergenerationally fair. In fact, if we take this to its logical conclusion, over the last 10 years, it's been systematically biased in favor of the present generations, older generations, very much biased against younger people, the future taxpayers. And in that context, it's also hard to avoid to look a bit at the sibling of the pensions discount rate, which is the sort of social discount rate, the social time preference rate used in other contexts, where more recently, as recently as the 2020 Green Book, actually, we've hit the point where government has put that in writing, that whenever intergenerational fairness is an issue, we should be using a lower discount rate than we would otherwise use, which I think is very interesting because it notably begs the question, where would you ever use a discount rate and you don't have intergenerational or intertemporal concerns at hand? But welcome to have this recognition. Alas, we aren't quite yet in a position where something is changing there, which brings me to the Iaf's proposal, which from a Young Liberals and Lib Dem point of view, we welcome as an interim step, because we clearly do have a bit of a window with the 2021 consultation into SCAPE to perhaps move forward a bit. On a long-term basis, of course, we do sympathize quite a bit with what Rowan said just a while back, which is that in terms of handing control over one key economic lever to an independent organization, we do have the precedent of monetary policy. Back in that arena, we had a rich economic literature, which we knew, well, politicians probably can't deal with this, or at least if we let them deal with it, outcomes are going to be suboptimal. And we also had a relatively broad consensus as to what our target with inflation should be. We wanted it to be low and we wanted it to be stable. And most people across party political lines, across generations, sort of agreed with that in the abstract. On the subject of discount rates, particularly once we start to broaden it beyond the pension sector, it's a bit harder to see that we have this consensus. In fact, to bring us back to our guiding theme, I think it's quite hard to see that many people are quite in the space to acknowledge that this is something that is quite inherently political, and it's probably quite hard to find a consensus on something that is, at the end of the day, distributing wealth from one generation to the other by valuing future benefits more lightly or more firmly. And hence, in the long term, we probably should be feeling quite uneasy with handing such an indicator away from the political arena and into the hands of pure technocratic means. So in order to tackle intergenerational unfairness on a very narrow field in discounting, but more broadly, really Young Liberals hope to use this debate and the wider sphere to make intergenerational fairness an issue that becomes so visible that policymakers simply naturally cannot avoid it.
I want to thank everybody for their contributions. That's been fantastic. Now, Mike Hampton has asked a question. I'm going to press a blue button that says, I'm going to allow Mike Hampton to talk. Now, Mike, you've got to behave yourself. Here we go. So is he going to come and ask the question? No. So Mike, his question has been pensions for, let me have a look at the chat. Does anybody want to come back to Joseph, actually, while I'm just bringing up the question on the chat? Sorry, there was a delay there. Is everybody else okay?
I think that was Mike, actually, who we could hear that from. I don't know if Mike knows that their microphone is live.
He doesn't seem to be here. Okay, so Mike's question was, pensions for academic staff at unis is very salient to young people. Of course, the big question at the moment is the USS pension scheme. And his comment is, tuition fees directly fund the employer contributions to the schemes. When employer contribution rates increase, uni operating income must fund the cost. So often the budget is directed away from the student experience and over to the pension funds. TP scheme, for example, the TP scheme a couple of years ago, and impending USS increases. Shall I start with you, Angus? I mean, are you aware of what the discount rate is with the USS pension scheme?
I'm not, sorry, can I just backtrack, Liz, to the extent of saying the reason that the USS scheme, sorry, that's scheme, isn't it? The university superannuation scheme is of so much interest to everyone is because it is a scheme where the rubber hits the road. They've actually got a limited amount of money in real investments, and they've got to cut their cloth accordingly. They can only spend what they've got. Whereas the other schemes that have been mentioned in the chat, such as the teachers scheme and the NHS scheme, which are the two big ones, and the civil service scheme, which is a fairly big one, and the police and armed services schemes, those are the four big ones I've just mentioned. All of those are basically just promises. The local government scheme's a bit of a hybrid. It's got some funding, but there's an implicit government guarantee. But the USS scheme really has to make difficult decisions because it's got a fixed amount of, it's not got a backup of government guarantee, except to the extent, as said in the chat, that one of the implications of that is that a considerable degree of finances for future pensions is being made by tuition fees, and so that creates a pressure to keep tuition fees high. I think that's all I'd say on that, Liz. You wanted a brief answer. No, I don't know the exact discount rate they use. Sorry.
Okay, so a bonus point if any of the panelists know what the discount rate is for the USS scheme. I don't think you do. Does anybody want to come back at Angus?
I mean, I do happen to know it, but that's because USS is one of my main clients.
Oh, that's cheating. That's insider knowledge.
But what I will say is that it, like many private sector schemes, is based on a gilt plus a margin model. And that is to say, it uses the yield on government bonds, gilts, plus a margin to reflect the fact that their investment portfolios would expect to return more than the yield on government bonds over the long term, and that is a way that private sector schemes can be easily compared to one another. And in particular, when I say the rate on government borrowing, I mean over the duration of the liabilities of the scheme, right? So if a pension had to be paid in 20 years' time, you would be discounting that using the 20-year government bond plus the margin. So that's true for the vast majority of private sector schemes, and it's publicly available information on the USS because they publish all their reports. I think it's worth noting that when we sort of make the comparison between these funded private sector schemes and unfunded schemes, on the one hand, you could say, well, actually, the discount rate is the least of our worries from an intergenerational fairness perspective, because as a matter of fact, all of these benefits have to be paid out of future revenue. Whereas, with a typical private sector scheme, the idea, at least, is that it comes from the assets that scheme holds. Now, the counterpoint to that is to go, well, the state pension is like that, right? And the idea is that, yes, we as taxpayers now have to pay people's current pensions, but we will get our pensions paid by future taxpayers. And so it's a sort of sustainable Ponzi scheme, right? So that's the idea, at least. The question that you might ask about that, though, is if you think that GDP is the sort of at least the right best estimate rate, even if you were to allow some margin for prudence, and if you were to reflect the fact that we might just get GDP expectations wrong long term, as Josef points out. But does the spending that we do on the public services that that we're paying these pensions in respect of, does that spending generate GDP growth in the way that the average piece of spending does? And if not, you could reasonably argue that the sensible return on assets as a comparison is nothing actually like GDP. It could be something else. Now, it could be more, of course. I don't think it would be more, but it could be. If you're trying to compare between the private sector and the public sector, I think that's a point where you can maybe pick apart the comparison.
Sorry, Liz.
Angus, sorry, yeah, I was trying to, yeah.
We were both on mute, talking to each other. Not a first time, I think, with a Zoom call. Yeah, I take those points, Kyalo. Can I add something a slightly different angle but relevant to what Josef was saying, which is that at the 2011 review of discount rates, what was really implied was they were setting a rate so that they could get the contributions that employees make, they could get those right. And the idea was that if the two would match up. Now, what's changed is that in the recent review, they've said, actually, we're not going to, whatever happens, we're not going to change their contributions. All we're trying to do is use this to let them realize how valuable a benefit they get. And that's a very different and slightly subtle change that they've made, but it makes all the difference in the world between saying this rate is about how much you contribute, because it ought to be far, far more. If pensions are worth, in some cases, 60% of salary, the employees paying 10% of salary for that benefit is a huge underpayment. And particularly for higher paid pensioners, that's a quite regressive benefit, because being paid by the future taxpayers, particularly in a higher amounts than it is for lower paid workers. Sorry.
It is perhaps worth noting, sorry, I'll be very quick, that while, yeah, it might be the case that some people are getting pensions worth 60%, you're talking about someone very close to retirement at that point who's going to have it paid very soon. If you're talking about someone in their 20s, say, or early 30s or even 40s, it would never get anywhere near that level.
Fair point, yes. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Tim Lund, and his question is, are either politicians or technocrats free to set a discount rate? Any qualms about discount rates which differ from market rates? Panelists, anybody got any qualms? Chris, do you want to come in? No?
Unless, Chris, you can go first, otherwise I'll...
Well, you can go first, Josef.
Dive in, Josef, and then Chris.
So I think it's, if we're looking at past performance, that certainly has been the case, that perhaps not politicians, but more the civil servants and HMT have found ways to be quite flexible. And by flexible, I actually probably mean not flexible at all to react to reality changing around them. If we look at the sibling of the pension discount rate, the social time preference rate, that one's closing in on its 20th birthday of being left completely unchanged, despite at least in the nearer past, increasing amounts of evidence piling up that really it should be lowered for a whole host of reasons. But since Kyalo and Angus both mentioned it, one reason particularly being increasing uncertainty about future growth in sustainable consumption, which if we are risk averse, should mean we should be using a lower discount rate. And that whole argument so far has been essentially bypassed by just keeping that rate fixed. And in broader terms, of course, it can be quite legitimate to aim off a market interest rate. We very much outside the pension space in particular might have like genuine normative concerns about how much we should value certain future costs on certain future benefits. But in the current state of the world, we are almost explicitly not allowing any checks on our thinking at all. We are engaged in a very narrow debate we're having occasionally, where we once in a while look at what our discount rate is, not really talk about it in a very open sphere. We have a consultation which doesn't exactly attract too many responses, and we thus end up with discount rates that are largely fixed over time. And that is probably even more suboptimal than, say, a state of the world where someone, say in the Bank of England, say in the Office for Budget Responsibility, essentially tracks a risk-free index gilt yields on a, say, 50-year Treasury bill. That will have some volatility, but given it's a 50-year one, that won't be too much. But it at least reflects some kind of updating towards reality, as opposed to the present setup we seem to be in, whereby we aren't really willing to look at new evidence as it comes in.
Yeah. We've had,
If I may, Liz, sorry, just there was the first part of that question asked kind of, are politicians or technocrats are either free to set a real discount, a true discount rate? Because Joseph mentioned earlier about kind of, why do we want to hand this political tool? We've been talking about kind of discount rates being an essential tool for bringing about intergenerational equity and sustainable livelihoods for all generations. So why do we want to hand this political tool to unelected technocrats? And I think there is a question there, is our democracy that broken that the only way to fix it is to take this decision out of democracy and to give it to technocrats? And there is the argument that if it's a problem with democracy, shouldn't we fix that rather than relying on people who may not be as accountable and may kind of, there was this whole idea, I think, kind of throughout the Brexit vote in 2016, throughout the election of Trump, kind of people taking back control of things that have been given to experts, and political decisions potentially being kind of obscured with economic jargon and mathematical tools. I think there does need to be the awareness that economics is not neutral and not subjective. It's in fact kind of highly value laden, and that lots of these values are political and need discussion and debate. So I think what we're doing tonight actually is really important, to be able to put that discussion of pension funding back into the political discourse, and in a way that people understand, in a way that we're able to raise intergenerational issues, the issues for spending plans, the issues of transparency, and that we can bring the public and all stakeholders in to contribute on these issues and kind of be able to co-produce through the political system with economists a system that takes account of those concerns.
Yeah, Chris had his hand up. Chris, you were going to come in then.
Yeah, just to echo what Rowan and Josef have been saying, there's a need to balance both, I'd say, between political and technical details. And that's because on the political spectrum, the politicians will have an idea as to how they want to spend the money, what the spending priorities are in terms of public spending. So there's a need to for their input there, and there's also a need for expert input as well. because the experts will know exactly what the true situation is. So I'd say a balanced approach will be the best regarding the question. And also in regard to the point around discount rates differing from market rates, from what I understand, there's no direct comparison with market rates, and that's because the private sector, like what Kyalo was discussing earlier, actually operates on a different risk and reward from the public sector. If the company in the private sector actually goes bust, the question is who will be picking up the tab for the pension bill that they cannot be paying. And whereas for the public sector, there are means to go about it. For instance, around issuing bonds or instruments that the government can actually undertake for hopefully short-term measures rather than long-term ones, and producing an economy that's reliant on bonds.
Okay. Thanks.
I think that just to sort of summarize that, I think it seems reasonable that you would ask elected politicians in conversation with their electorates to establish what they think is fair, i.e., how the burden of risk sharing should be carried between generations, right? I don't think it would be sensible to ask politicians to set the actual rates, because I just think the level of technical knowledge required to understand the concepts is far beyond even people who are casually acquainted with the subject, let alone the average politician or the average voter. So it would be reasonable to ask politicians to establish what we're trying to achieve, and then I think it makes much more sense to have I mean, as an unelected technocrat myself, to have the unelected technocrats come up with the answer for that through discussion and through, of course, with scrutiny and so on and so forth. I think it's worth noting really that we kind of have two separate discussions, or two and a half, right? One of which is how do we, on what are we trying to base the rate on? Should it be GDP? Should it be the rate of government borrowing? Should it be something in between, so on and so forth? And then what do we determine that to be? And then there's a sort of supplementary question to either of them is, do we have any margin for prudence, bearing in mind that we might, do we err on one side or other because the consequences of getting it wrong in the other direction are worse, right?
Okay, here we go. My gentle challenge is everyone on the panel, where would you be on that spectrum? So do you want to put yourself out there, Kyalo? Is it part GDP?
Yeah, so I think so I wouldn't use government borrowing because I think realistically government borrowing is substantially lower than we can reasonably expect the economy to grow. Even in bad scenarios, it's substantially lower, and government borrowing depends on lots of things that are nothing really to do with how the economy is doing, in fact. So I don't think that's just even if it's a stable measure and a robust one, it can't be fiddled by politicians who are hoping to, get more money for their spending priorities in the short term. It fundamentally is, it's hard to draw a line until we must draw it in the wrong place, because it's, we can at least identify that place. That's not that helpful. So I think the correct basis is to think about something like GDP, but I think it's reasonable to say, but we should recognize that we're inclined to overestimate and be too optimistic with these things, and that the growth we've experienced in the 5 decades really since the Second World War is higher than it has ever been over a sustained period of time in the UK, or really in any other period of history for any country almost. So given that we come from that normality, we may need to be more historically mindful of what those growth rates should be, and maybe we should be more prudent in how we set them.
Okay, here we go. Tim Lunt has asked Kyalo, would Kyalo have a stable margin over the market rate?
So I don't think there is a market rate. If you mean the market rate of government borrowing, the margin being stable wouldn't achieve anything, because the rate of government borrowing fluctuates substantially. So you would still have an unstable rate. I guess I would have a a stable margin below GDP expectations. That wouldn't necessarily produce a stable outcome because GDP expectations can vary, but given that it is a long-term estimate, if our estimates are at all credible, they shouldn't vary by too much. Unfortunately, even if they vary by a little bit, it will have a very substantial effect on the overall amount, as Angus has pointed out, because it gets amplified over many years, right? So if you apply a 1% change of 50 years, you get something below 50%, but yeah, that can't really be avoided, unfortunately, because you're dealing with long-term liabilities. So in answer to your original question, by the way, I would err on the side of caution and of saying they were slightly more expensive than we maybe would best estimate think they are, to account for the fact that we could be overly optimistic, and the fact of getting it wrong in the direction of being overly optimistic is worse than the consequence of getting it wrong in the other direction.
Interesting. Angus, do you want to come back on that? What?
I'd say Kyalo, I respect Kylo's huge knowledge and his opinion on this. I'd say there's an inconsistency though, isn't there? Because you're saying in the private sector, you're happy for them to use an interest rate, basically a high grade interest rate, and add some margin for error. But in the government sector, which you parallel very nicely with the private sector by saying the equivalent for the government of their business is the whole economy, in that case, you're willing to allow them to use the growth of the economy as or something adjusted from that as a discount rate. So I would say stick to the private sector. They're the ones who are dealing with real money, and we should copy something like them. I like the idea of a margin for prudence, but I'd also say that the whole question, one of the questions is, who benefits from a GDP growth that's higher than long-term expectations? Because in the last 50 years, the people who've benefited are the older generation. They benefited because their equity investments have gone up more than they might reasonably have expected, and they've benefited because their house prices have gone up more.
Okay, Joseph wants to come in now, Angus.
Yeah, 2 points really. One quickly on the GDP side. Not exactly a friend here, because even if, big if, we manage to come up with a sane and stable view of expected GDP growth, really the answer we need discounting wise also has to answer what are our attitudes on risk aversion. And since that is a highly subjective and very much a social question, we are immediately back into normative territory. So really we risk kidding ourselves that we can be objective there. So I think we're in for a false hope there. And the second point being, opening a big field here now, Angus and Kyalo already did some nice contrasting between the public sectors, the unfunded scheme, and the sort of typical private sector pension scheme, which really then raises the question, okay, is that an appropriate comparison to make? Because given these schemes are unfunded, that is by itself a significant benefit we are affording to those future pensioners. Perhaps not in terms of wealth. We can say there's some generic entitlement for those people to have a pension scheme, but at the very least, it is a transfer of risk, whereby we're transferring quite a lot of uncertainty away from the beneficiaries towards us, society. And those transfers typically are very political decisions. We have a social discount rate for this. We happen to have not updated this social discount rate for a long while, but we know from work of consultancies and academics what that discount rate, if we had to set it afresh, would be. And if we, big if, question, really very much two legitimate answers to that question, if we decide to view an unfunded public sector scheme as primarily being that transfer of risk and uncertainty away from future pensioners to society, then really we might be running more towards a social discount rate, excluding a catastrophic risk element.
Chris, you had your hand up, but have we gone past where you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I would just say I echo the point that Kyalo made. I think GDP growth is reasonable measure for us to use for discount rate. My only thing is that we should monitor these projections regularly, because they can be really off sometimes, especially in the case of COVID projected growth rates following COVID. And in these uncertain times, there's a need to really monitor what these are and update them regularly. And I think on the point that Tim mentioned about the tuition fee and 3% on student loan, yeah, I would say I think it's exorbitant compared to the market real interest rate of negative interest rates. And yeah, I think there's a whole debate to be had for another occasion as well. Thank
you very much for that, Chris. Rowan, did I see you wanting to come in?
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot about GDP, and I'm thinking about how you can decompose the discount rate often into kind of two parts, of one being a time preference part and one being a wealth part, both of which we have environmental issues with. Obviously, the time preference part being kind of whether you'd rather have something, kind of harking back to what Angus was saying at the start, rather would you rather have something beneficial in the present or at some future date? And obviously, reality and experiments kind of suggest that people would rather have things now than have things later. We have a kind of a positive time preference in the economics jargon. So somewhat ironically, the suggestion that we're going to be undermining the future possibility for future life of human beings on Earth might actually greatly increase our time preference for present consumption. And then on the wealth point, the wealth assumption we make generally is that incomes will rise, meaning that future generations are going to be richer than the present one. So looking through that in the lens of intergenerational fairness, again, somewhat ironically, it feels like we should be doing less to protect future generations because we're assuming that the economy is going to grow and we're going to be richer. And so we are the poor, and that those that come after us are the rich. And so there's this strange idea that we strike a blow for equality by taking our children's inheritance and then spending it on ourselves today. And then what Angus mentioned at the start, obviously Greens recognise that the desire for persistent and perpetual economic growth is driving resource use and environmental changes to the point where we are limiting the potential for future generations to enjoy comfortable lives. So with that sense in mind, you could even reasonably suggest adding a negative wealth component to the discount rate to reflect the damage that GDP growth is going to be doing to future generations.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Rowan. I remember in my marketing time back in the early 90s, we were all amazed when Sony announced that they had a 50-year marketing plan. And we all scurried away to our corporates going, Sony's got a 50-year marketing plan. We need a 50-year marketing plan. And in the same way, that the problem with the discount rate is thinking about so far in the future that when we have the likes of global pandemics and COVID-19 and the huge liabilities that are going to be foisted on our younger taxpayers today, how do people like Kyalo do the job that they do? Because obviously it's very difficult. But Kyalo, I think you wanted to respond. You look like...
Yeah. So just very briefly on the time preference. I agree. I mean, well, I think there's an interesting philosophical concept. Is that if you went back 500 years and found people living in poverty, would it be moral to give them some of your wealth? I think it might be. So there's kind of an argument for stealing the wealth of future generations there, but I don't ultimately agree with it. So I won't spend a lot of time making an argument I don't agree with. It's just an interesting philosophical point, and something someone argued to me when I had this debate with them in the pub once. But I think but in terms of time preference, while I agree with you, we shouldn't build explicit time preference into our models because actually it represents a level of human irrationality, a desire to have something now and not to worry about the future. we would still have a money preference, right? Because if you have money now, you can invest it and you get a better return, and you also have more flexibility, right? Because you could choose to spend it now, or you could choose to spend it later. Whereas if you have it later, you've got no option, right? So there's certainly a positive money preference, even if you ignore the positive time preference, money time preference, if you see what I mean. But I think the more fundamental point to this discussion is, and it's kind of like a classic civil servant's fudge almost, right, is that you can bridge the gap between my position and Angus's position very easily, because both of us had margins relative to our rates, right? So I said that you should start from GDP growth and have a margin for prudence, and Angus says you should start from government borrowing rates and have a margin above that, like the private sector does. Well, the fact is, depending on how you set that margins, you can get the same rate, right? So in truth, ultimately what you're doing is making a subjective judgment as about how much prudence you should have, or how much of a less prudence you should have compared to government borrowing. And again, it's hard to have a substantive argument about that, because it's numbers, right? And really what you need to do is run a load of projections and see what happens in different scenarios, and work out what level of risk you're comfortable with, and what level of risk you're comfortable with taking now and putting on to future generations. But that sort of like, that I think that's the analysis that needs to be done in order to get the right answer.
Yeah, Joseph.
Wonderful point just there, but I should add, I don't think we quite, as far as the electorate is concerned, or society at large really, don't need to take it to the analysis level just yet, because if we take, say, the base rate of income tax, we could, and we do, obviously, with a number of people sort of being in the very low hundreds, approach this from a perspective of a social welfare function, and perhaps optimizing tax revenue, perhaps optimizing incentives, all sorts of different objectives. But really, the electorate at large probably is quite aware, and we know it is quite aware of roughly where political parties, political ideology would stand on this rate. They don't particularly need to, or indeed want to, understand all the intricacies on efficiency grounds. And at least to me, being ever so slightly optimistic about society at large, I think we can, at the very least, have a conversation in which a discount rate, a social discount rate, admittedly perhaps not being something that's exclusively in pension space, can serve as a symbolic measure of how political parties and society at large wants to trade off present benefits for future benefits. Whilst, of course, the efficiency analyses and calculations, as Kyalo suggested, will always be in the hands of HMT and associated bodies. I think there is a genuine political argument to be had about that margin of prudence, or the margin above market rates in Angus' framework, which is inherently political and can be approached from pretty much just the same level of detail that we currently afford to a lot of other important economic parameters.
Thank you so much, Joseph. We've actually been speaking about the discount rate and pensions for an hour and 10 minutes, I believe. So what I think we need to do is start to wrap up. But what I really hope we can do is take this conversation forwards as a group of cross-party representatives. I would urge everybody to read the pamphlets that is on the Iaf website, which has the different contributions from each political party. And I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for having such a stimulating conversation. We are living in very uncertain times. As a mother of a 23-year-old and a 19-year-old, where the 23-year-old has a marginal tax rate of over 40%, with his student debt and income tax and national insurance. We have a younger generation that's going to be increasingly overburdened, and pension schemes that are using rates that perhaps need some sort of reform. It's how we get there is the question. So can I thank you all for sparing the time tonight, and let's keep the conversation going. Okay.
Thank you very much, Liz, for chairing this all
Thank you
so efficiently.
Thank you very
On that
much,
point,
everyone.
also
Well done.
thank you very much to the Iaf for your continued commitment. I should say long-standing rather than continued commitment to this cause. I noted you were one of the original 2011 consultation respondees.
Yeah. Yes,
Thank you for all of that, and we're certainly from our end, and I think from all of our ends, looking forward to seeing your work in the future.
Thank you,
very
Joseph.
much, Joseph.
And thank you, Kyalo. Thank you, Rowan.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody, for coming and listening. Do send any inquiries to Liz at if.org.uk. Any questions for the panelists, and I can forward them on. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.